Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and this short video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous night of the local time. Today we have a lot of very interesting details and updates, so let's start. As you know, Zelensky on the US support for Ukraine, I think they could give us even more to win. We won't be able to survive without the US. You know, when I read this article, I believe many of you thought about the difficulties between the relations between the United States of America and Ukraine and Zelensky himself. But when I read this article, first I thought about was the gap between the Ukraine authorities and regular people in Ukraine, and the distance between them is getting bigger and bigger. And I see sometimes that regular Ukrainians, are living in one Ukraine, and Zelensky and his team are living in completely different Ukraine. For example, today we got a very interesting photo, very funny photo, you might say. Of course, not about the situation. If there going to be no war, if there were no war in Ukraine, probably that photo was very funny and we could laugh at this funny photo together. But there is a war, and this photo makes me feel at least uncomfortable. On this photo we can see just a regular bus, a very dirty bus that we used to saw before a lot of times when the Ukrainian military authorities entered such a buses and started making mobilizations. And you can see on the back, on the dirty back of this bus, a small title F-16. You know, this is not just like just a joke, it's like a symbol. You know, that it's just like a symbol, very, very tragic symbol of Ukrainian special military operation. Probably this is the only F-16 Ukraine can rely on. But the problem is that not just that Ukrainians are not going to receive anything in the future. The problem is that the Ukrainians are losing time. They're losing, and by losing time, they're losing people who are fighting somewhere in Avdiivka, somewhere in, let's say, Vremivka and Krynki, while Zelensky and his team waits for the upcoming or the next military aid that probably is not going to happen ever. Now we're moving to the situation on the ground, and the most important things are coming, of course, from Avdiivka. As you can see, we have a lot of icons, a lot of updates, details. Yesterday, in the previous update, we have already started discussion that according to some Russian sources, the Russians managed to attack and to establish control or to enter the 9th quarter in Avdiivka, but during the previous night and by the morning, we haven't received any confirmations of that, but we got a lot of updates from the southern part of Avdiivka. Different mappers, different sources shows completely different pictures, but more or less from the same direction. So let's start. According to some, let's say, updates in the southern coverage of Avdiivka, storm assault groups made their way through Tsarskaya Khota recreation center along Soborny Street in Avdiivka. If we return back to the map, this is the Tsarskaya Khota fortification, this one, and according to some sources, the Russians managed to bypass this fortification belt by Soborny Street and to move further inside of Avdiivka area, the residential part of Avdiivka area. Furthermore, for example, the deep state map confirms the same progress, or at least they are saying that the territory that is considered by the Russians as the territory of their control currently by the deep state is considered as the gray zone. We have one video of one girl who is fighting, or maybe she was fighting in Ukraine, who knows, that the Russians managed to break through the Ukrainian defense belt in the vicinity of Kamyanka and in the vicinity of Tsarskaya Khota. So this is Tsarskaya Khota area, and Kamyanka is the village that located on the eastern part. So according to her, another wave of attack, the Russians started somewhere here and also managed to penetrate Ukraine's defense belt. Just a few days ago we were talking about the Russian tank attacks in this area, and very likely that she tells us the truth. Furthermore, we got more details. According to other sources, like Russian more or less reliable sources, the Russians managed to penetrate the Ukraine defense belt and to establish control, or at least not to establish, but to enter a very big, let's say, part of residential area on the southern part of Avdiivka. So according to some Russian sources, as a result of clashes, the Russians established control over this territory. As you can see, the progress is very huge. I'm not saying that the Russians managed to dig in deeper. Probably there are a few some Ukrainian squads that were encircled, that the clashes continues. Maybe the Ukrainians now start to stabilize the front line by moving more and more reinforcements and reserves in the central part of Avdiivka, trying to slow down the Russians. Who knows? But once again, according to these Russian sources, the Russians managed to reach the Chernyshevskovo Street and Sportivnaya Street. Also, the Russians have progress along Sabornaya, right inside in the direction of the central part. If we move to the map, we're going to see that this is Chernyshevskovo Street. This one I will mark on map. This is Chernyshevskovo Street, and according to the Russian sources, they managed to get this line. Also, the source reported that the Russians managed to get Sportivnaya Street, and this is Sportivnaya Street. And also the Russians managed to advance along Sabornaya Street. And Sabornaya Street is the street, this is Sabornaya Street that Tsarskaya Okhota fortification area is relying on. So these three streets, according to lots of Russian resources, was captured by the Russians during the previous night or previous days. You know that, of course, it's hard to believe to such a big progress from the Russian side, but let's wait for today. It's like the second day for very heavy clashes in this area, so very likely that something happened and maybe the Russians managed to achieve such significant results. For example, the more or less neutral resources like Syriac reports that about some progress just on the southern part, just the area along the railways, but without such a deep, let's say, progress inside of the central part. Anyway, let's discuss about the consequences and if this information about such a big Russian progress in direction of Sportivnaya, Chernyshevskaya, and Slobodskaya and Sabornaya Street progress, let's say right to this corner. That means that Ukrainian positions in the former air defense base and Cheburashka stronghold are at risk. And very likely, if the Russians are able to dig in deeper on this new defense belt like this one, of course, the Ukrainian forces that are located in the southern part, in these former air defense belts, will collapse automatically. And we need to expect that within the next few days, this entire area will collapse automatically and the Russians will establish full control over very, very huge territories, which will deal significant damage to the entire Ukraine defense configuration. Everything will be collapsed to the south of the 9th quarter and the Russians will be able to start the final battle, the final rush in direction of the central part of Avdiivka from many directions. Furthermore, we still haven't received a lot of details from Kamyanka direction. The only thing we have is the updates of deep state map that show us about some progress, and also very likely the Russians managed to enter or to reach this defense belt and to bypass the stronghold on the eastern part. So as we can see, the final rush from the Russian side has started. We have just few videos from inside of Avdiivka that shows the movements of Ukrainian forces that are moving from the southern and the central part to the northern part in direction of a chemical plant. I'm not sure whether we are able to consider this video as the, let's say, withdrawing process or retreat process, but anyway, we understand that the weather is the best for offensive operation because, as you can see, this territory completely covered with fog, and that means that the Russians can attack and without any risk without any risk of being attacked by the Ukraine FPV drones or being discovered by the Ukraine intelligence, because they just can't do this. This territory is completely under fog, at least during the morning period of time. It's very difficult for defenders to counterattack the Russians and to defend their positions. When talking about northern flank, we haven't received anything from Stepova, Berdichi, but the question is it important now about any progress in this direction if the central and the southern part of Avdiivka has been almost collapsed by the Russians? So we'll follow the situation today because, as I understand, today very likely we're going to start receiving some geolocated videos which will allow us to confirm or not, or let's say unprove the updates we received. Now we are moving to Artyomovsk Bakhmut direction. We have a lot of interesting details from Bagdanovka area that can give us possibilities to adjust the map and to understand the real line of combat contact. For example, on this video we can see how the Russian soldiers were establishing the flag in the northeastern part of Bagdanovka, which confirms for 100% the Russian control over this territory. There are a few important things: that one soldier in the establishing the flag, and the second one is staying around trying to understand and trying to discover whether they were discovered by the drones or not. Anyway, this is 100% evidence of Russian control. On the another video we can see the Russian FPV drone strike against the Ukrainian positions in the central part of Bagdanovka, which confirms the Ukrainian control over this territory. So now we understand more or less the approximate the combat line and the edge positions either of the Russians and the Ukrainians. So as I understand, the map more or less corresponds to the reality. This is the Russian positions, this is the Ukrainian positions, and this is the territory between the positions are in the gray zone. Now we are moving further because we have significant updates from Kupiansk-Liman direction, to be more precise, from Kupiansk. If you remember, just yesterday we discussed that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed from Vladimirovka in direction of Krakhmalna-Tabaevka, managed to establish fire control over the road N26 that goes from, let's say, Берестовая, Kislovka-Kotляровka, Krakhmalna, Novosilovka, Берестовая. So this road, according to the Russian sources, was cut by the Russians with, let's say, fire control. And during the previous night, we got like the video of Ukrainian counterattack because they needed to restore connection, and so that's why they were trying to counterattack the edge Russian positions and forces that were trying to dig in deeper on the new, let's say, territories. On this video, we can see the Ukraine Bradley, who was attacking the Russian forces. Then we see the Ukrainian stormtroopers, storm group, and they were storming this area. And as a result of clashes, the Russian forces took a decision to retreat, and they withdraw their positions and they moved back to they crossed the railways and returned back to the forest, so something like this. So at this stage, this attack from the Russian side finished with nothing. But as I understand, there are going to be more attempts because the Russians are planning to probably to collapse this defense belt of the Ukrainian forces as well. And during the Ukrainian movements, the Russians were bombing the Ukrainian forces who were moving to the Russian positions with TOS flamethrower systems. So as you can see, the clashes here are very heavy. From both sides, we see Ukrainian counterattacks, we see Russian artillery, we see Russian TOS flamethrower systems, we see significant Russian number of Russian infantry. And as I understand, the Russians are planning or trying to capture Berestova or just to bypass this territory. Furthermore, the Russians launched their offensive operation from Yagidne to Ivanovka. On this video, we can see Russian infantry that was moving from one position to another. At some point, the Ukrainians start bombing them. This video confirms that these territories under Russian control, or at least in the gray zone, but not on the Ukrainian one. The Russians do have their positions there, so that's why we have possibility and have the right to adjust the map before the next video. So the clashes in direction of Ivanovka also renewed from the Russian side. As you can see, the situation once again is getting worse and worse for the Ukrainians, and the thing is that they still haven't received anything, and probably F-16s that currently the Ukrainians have won't be able to help them in the upcoming, let's say, phase of the special military operation. And that's it for the short video. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes to my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.